Jews find it very hard to talk about God. Is that statement true or not? Let me know in the comments below. But we are going to be talking about God, and not just God, but meaning, covenant, and transcendence in this final installment in our Identity, Belonging, and Meaning series on A Small Sanctuary. Welcome back, friends, to this final installment of my 3-part series, there you go, on A Small Sanctuary. I have already done 2 episodes on identity and belonging, so feel free to look those up in the show notes, and I'm here to push on with the episode on covenant. What have we been talking about in the past? We've been talking about the internal Jewish identity that people can cultivate in themselves. Like, what does it mean to feel Jewish? I differentiated between identity and status and explained how those work and how they intersect or how they differ. And then in the second episode, I talked about belonging, how to belong to a Jewish community, how Jewish communal life works, and if you want to belong to a Jewish community, how to go about doing that in a really fruitful and productive and non-intimidating way. I received some comments about, well, what about the next episode? Where is God in all of this? Well, God is there. And we're going to talk about that as well, because I actually see these things on a continuum where we start with our internal sense of who we are and who we know ourselves to be, with the identity piece. And then we live out that identity with our fellow human beings in the communal piece. And we are going to now embed this whole thing of the human being, the Jewish human being, in the broader existential context of the transcendent, aka God. I've talked at length already that Judaism is an ethno-religion. It has both components of a cultural, historical identity, known as an ethnos, as well as a religious, civilizational project with shared values, shared scriptures, and a shared mission. Now, we have talked about ethnos a lot already because identity and community really touch about our sense of peoplehood. Now we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about covenant. I think that one of the ways we can define the Jewish people is actually by calling us a covenant people. I really like that because I don't think we should favor one over the other. Some Jews might place more emphasis on peoplehood. Some Jews might place more emphasis on covenant, but it is a continuum, and how we balance these things against each other is up to each of us to decide. But today it is time for covenant. So let's start at the beginning and say, well, what actually is a covenant? It's a strange word. It seems kind of old-fashioned. And I think it's important to really understand what a covenant is. A covenant is a kind of spiritual or emotional or moral contract between two parties, which may or may not be equal in standing, but is by its very nature reciprocal. So you don't need to be completely of equal rank, because covenants in the ancient world were made between, emperors and their vassal kings, or masters and their servants, and so often there was a power differential, but that doesn't mean there is no reciprocity and no mutual care and obligation towards each other. So a covenant is basically a reciprocal relationship with legal standing. Judaism is not the only religion that works with covenants. It's something that Judaism is really well known for, but basically every religion, or most religions, work with a covenantal consciousness, a sense that there is mutuality between the divine and the community of believers. That is not unique to Judaism, but we do really emphasize it a lot in Judaism. Having said that, even within Judaism, the covenant is not only for Jews. So let's talk a little bit of Bible here, and I'm going to talk you through two covenants, one for the Jewish people and one for all of humanity, and their respective dispensations or supersessions. There are 4 covenants that are established in the Hebrew Bible, and there are renewals of covenants periodically as well. Covenanting is not a static act, it's an act that has ongoing, renewing qualities to it. And sometimes covenants are restated, kind of like a renewal of vows. So the first covenant that we see in the Hebrew Bible is the Adamic covenant, i.e. when Adam and Eve, Adam and Chava, were created in the Garden of Eden, Gan Eden, God made a covenant with them. So when Adam and Eve left the Garden of Eden, which is a story that we in the Jewish community do not necessarily interpret in a negative way, but that would be a whole different video, me talking about how to interpret the creation story. But basically we see it as them coming into adulthood and being able to negotiate their relationship with God on their own terms, even though there's an aspect of severing away from the Garden of Eden. The relationship with God is not severed at all. On the contrary, in some ways, you could argue it becomes much closer. So this is the covenant between God and all of humanity, the Adamic covenant. That covenant is later superseded or displaced by the secondary covenant with all of humanity, which is the Noahide covenant. So now we're going from Genesis chapters 1, 2, and 3 to Genesis chapters 6, 7, and 8, where Noah gets called by God to build his ark. He has about 120 years to build the ark and to save him and his family, and famously all of the animals 2 by 2 and sometimes 7 by 7. That's always a detail that gets overlooked somehow. It's not all the animals 2 by 2. And reestablishes the human race after the flood for a new universal human covenant. And we still use this idea of the Noahide covenant today, which gets reinterpreted rabbinically as the Sheva mitzvot b'nei Noach, the 7 commandments for all humanity, kind of a universal moral ethic that rabbinic Judaism invites all human beings to maintain, irrespective of whether they're Jewish or not. And these 7 Noahide commandments are kind of like the 10 commandments, except more universalist and applicable to all humanity. Now the Talmud really goes to town on this. I don't want to get too much into this because I want to talk about the Jewish covenant, but it is clear in the Hebrew Bible and the rabbinic writings both that God concerns God's self with all of humanity, and so do Jewish ethics. That's not a non-Jewish idea, that's not a foreign idea. All human beings can have their distinct relationship and their unique relationship with God through their own covenant. Now we're going to fast forward to the Judaic covenant, which is a little bit of an anachronism because it wasn't Judaic at the time, it was Abrahamic. So we're going to go to Genesis chapter 12, where Abraham is called on his mission and pushing forward from that point on. Of course, Genesis chapter 12 is the very famous line, Lech lecha me'artzecha mimoladetecha, etc. Go forth from yourself or into yourself, however you want to translate that, from the place of your birth, your homeland, your father's house, to a land that I will show you. So this is Abraham's mission. It's a wonderful chapter in the Torah that's worth reading and distilling kind of Abraham's place in the world to be a blessing to all the nations. This covenant is made, but it's not the only covenant that is made with Abraham. A little further on, there is a very mysterious covenant called the Covenant of the Pieces. The Covenant of the Pieces is kind of an esoteric ritual where Abraham has to slaughter a number of animals, as was common for ancient worship, and he splits the carcasses of the animals and then he puts them side by side to kind of create a sacred pathway through, and then he walks through it under the cover of smoke and darkness and has this mystical experience. It is quite a strange text in some way, but this is kind of a recovenanting of Abraham. And then, of course, Abraham has the most famous covenant, which we still maintain today, which is Brit Milah, circumcision. Abraham circumcised himself at age 99, his household, including Ishmael and Yitzchak, Isaac at 8 days, and this is the covenant that Jewish males still maintain to this day. So already within the Abrahamic covenant, we have kind of a composite covenant. We have a covenant that is reshaped and made more specific with a new set of obligations and a new set of rewards each time. Once the Abrahamic covenant is established, we fast forward all the way to the book of Exodus, where we get the displacement of the Abrahamic covenant with the Sinaitic or the Mosaic covenant. So the Sinaitic or Mosaic covenant, it's already in the name, is the covenant that God creates with the entire Jewish people at Mount Sinai at the point of Matan Torah, or revelation, the giving of the Torah. The whole people witnesses it. They stand at the foot of the mount and they say, Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do and we will listen. And this becomes this secondary covenant that Jews have with God. Throughout biblical history, there are new covenants being made all the time. There are new covenants when Joshua recircumcises the generation of the desert that enters the land. There are covenants when the first temple is inaugurated. Further back in biblical history, there are covenants that Jews make with their neighbors, sometimes successfully, sometimes tragically, like the denizens of Shechem, who are then slaughtered by Shimon and Levi. This is not a pleasant story, but it is a form of covenanting. And so covenants can take place between human beings who have parity with each other, as well as human beings who enjoy a power differential between each other, and between God and human beings. So the takeaway for this first section in this episode is that covenants are not rare. They happen all the time in Jewish history and Jewish thought, and they are also not exclusive to Jews or Judaism. In the rabbinic understanding, covenants shape-shift again, because after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, Judaism has to reimagine itself after this disaster or catastrophe, which we call the Churban, the destruction. And in a way, the rabbinic imagining of the Shekhinah, the divine presence, going into Galut, into exile with the Jewish people, is a very archetypical rabbinic image, is in and of itself a covenant. And as Jewish history rolls on from the mythical into the actual, there is a lot of shape-shifting covenant theology. And with every Jewish breaking point in Jewish history, Jews sometimes find themselves asking, how is this difficult experience or traumatic experience part of the covenant? And there's even a whole branch of theology called Holocaust theology that argues whether the covenant between God and the Jewish people was actually reneged in the face of the Holocaust or not. That, again, is a whole different branch of theology. I will leave in the show notes a link to a series of talks by Rabbi and theologian Shai Held from Hadar, who shares a number of Holocaust theology lectures in podcast forms. So if you're interested to dig deeper into that, you can most certainly do so. So let's go to the present. We have established kind of a mythical, theological, and historical basis for the idea of covenants. But what does that look like today? I think the answers can be very individual. Like I said, not all Jews are religious, as I often like to joke with my congregants, and they really love this joke. Judaism is the religion that believes in one God or less. Now, I happen to believe in one God. I am a religious Jew, and I'm not an atheist. for more on Jewish theology, see my 3D theology episode. I will link it down below as well, how we can think about God in more meaningful and constructive ways that allows for our personal evolution and internal diversity. Okay, that was a sidebar. But I think it can vary widely between Jews. Some Jews understand God to be an idea, and other Jews understand God to be a reality, or both. But at least at minimum, defining God as an idea, as a figurehead in our philosophical conceptualization is already important and useful. And that is that there is this transcendent quality to all Jews being part of the Jewish people. And yes, we have a lot of internal divisions. I refer you to my previous episode to explore some of that. But there is a transcendent quality to Jews being connected to each other. We're not just an ethnic group. There is a deep well of meaning that we can drill into as we think about Jewish covenant. For those Jews who are more classically religious or who have a spiritual orientation, that covenantal consciousness can manifest in some kind of relational orientation towards the divine, or a very classical image of God being an active agent in the covenant with the Jewish people. For me, covenant expresses itself in three ways. Counting is hard. Mitzvah, meaning, and mission. And I want to drill down a little bit into this because I think covenant theology and covenant philosophy is really important. The challenge that I want to put towards my Jewish viewers is that what would happen if Judaism lost its covenantal consciousness or its covenantal thrust? Would we just become a people like other peoples? Would we lose some of our moral refinement? Would that alter our sense of self or our position in the world? I would argue, being a religious Jew after all, that covenant is really, really essential. And while I agree that we can reframe covenant and understand it on individual levels for each of us in ways that feels relevant and meaningful to us, I would argue that I think covenant is absolutely essential. And a sense of us entering into transcendence and opening ourselves up to transcendence as Jews is also really important. And as a sidebar, transcendence does not need to be theistic. I actually am a strong believer in that many people who would not class themselves as religious or as theistic still have deep, profound spiritual needs and needs for transcendence and an intuition for transcendence. Non-theistic spirituality is a really important thing to make space for in our communities. And I think Judaism does a really good job making space for non-theistic spirituality. Having said that, let's go with mitzvah, meaning, and mission. So mitzvah, commandment, is kind of intuitive if you are familiar with the Jewish concept of commandedness. Now, this can break out denominationally. Does commandment mean ritual, ethical, historical? Is it in a halachic Jewish legal framework or a post or non-halachic Jewish legal framework? There's all kinds of ways you can spin that, and I'm going to try and hold back because this video will get really out of control if I go down the denominational rabbit hole. So let's just accept mitzvah as face value, a commandment, an obligation that God places upon us as Jews that we are compelled to fulfill. So this is kind of the most basic layer of covenant theology, is that it's a two-way street, it's a reciprocal arrangement. And of course, you could ask, what is God's end of the bargain? And I think classical Jewish theology would say that God's end of the bargain is maintaining the integrity and the thriving and survival of the Jewish people, and ultimately bringing us to the Messianic era in a state of universal redemption. However, if we focus on our end of the bargain, our sense of obligation towards God, towards Torah and the Jewish people, is the foundation of that covenantal consciousness. And I think that mitzvah can be taken in many different ways. I know Jews who aren't religious, but they are incredibly devoted to the flourishing of Jewish communal life, and they feel obligated to maintain it and to imbue it with meaning and imbue it with joy. Even if they would say they don't believe in God, they support the institutions of Judaism, and that is also a mitzvah. That is a fulfillment of that mitzvah. For me, as a religious Jew, I do feel a sense of commandedness by God and the fulfillment of the mitzvot that God has placed upon me as part of the covenant. And that doesn't mean I do it all perfectly, or that I do them all, or that I get it right. But I live with that sense of obligation and consciousness, and live within that kind of philosophical framework and that relational framework. Because obligation sounds heavy, right? But for me and for many Jews, it's actually an expression of love and devotion. Just like if you would do things for the person you love, or for your friends or your family or your partner, you have obligations and you fulfill them out of love. That's very much how the Jewish covenant is framed as well, in a loving and nurturing way. The second layer of covenant is meaning. And meaning comes out of mitzvah. Mitzvot help generate us meaning through our festivals, Shabbat, the personal mitzvot, prayer, kashrut, tzedakah, doing justice in the world, whatever it is. But we derive meaning from Jewish acts, Jewish sacred pathways, Jewish communal living. And that meaning becomes an animating force for us maintaining the covenant. If we don't find meaning in mitzvot, well, then the whole structure will crumble. Again, meaning is highly individualized, and I think that one of the things I love about being a modern liberal Jew is that we have so many avenues to find meaning and perpetuate meaning in really creative and inclusive ways, and that's also kind of what this channel is about. The last one I think is underexplored in contemporary Judaism, but I promise you it is Jewish. I've had so many conversations about this word and all of its kind of triggers, because we tend to associate it with like Christian religious activity, but I promise you that this is a word that's common to Judaism, and that is mission, i.e. what is our purpose and what is our thrust and presence in the world as Jews. What does the covenant tell us to be in the world? And so, I could do a whole episode on the word mission and the Jewish mission and what it is and what it isn't. And it isn't, knocking on doors and telling people that, we have the truth and no one else does. And that's not what that word means at all. Think of it more in kind of like a business sense or a non-profit sense. Like an organization can have a mission statement. It articulates the why for its how. It articulates what we're meant to do in the world. So that's what I mean by mission. And covenant is also the generator of that sense of mission that we have in the world. And of course, I would say that the Jewish mission in the world is to be an or l'goyim, a light unto the nations. And well, that's a whole different video as well, how you can interpret that. But repairing the world, bringing justice, bringing kindness, bringing love, perpetuating Jewish thriving and learning and enrichment and growth, and growing the Jewish people and being part of the human family and contributing positively to the human family. I think that is part of our mission. But if you take these three elements of covenant together, mitzvah, meaning, and mission, it allows you to really reevaluate for yourself as a Jew what your sense of covenant is. And that is also kind of part of that transcendence, even in a non-theistic way. But I also think that it can be particularly powerful if you do see it as coming from God. If you do see it as coming from the divine, then it's like this luminescence, this numinous glow that is overlaid on our Jewish lives. And that is why this is the last episode in the series, because at the end of the day, our internal Jewish identity and our communal role is augmented and uplifted and sanctified through the covenantal consciousness. Just like Abraham went forth to develop his covenant with God, and Sarah went forth to develop her covenant with God, each of us is asked to go in ourselves, to explore at the deepest levels in the chambers of our own heart what Judaism is for us and what it means for us and how we carry it forth in the world. So I know I didn't cover everything. You never can. Like, when you're making Jewish content, you just can't cover everything. Like, it's impossible. It's impossible. So it is what it is. But I hope that this creates so much more meaning for you. And yeah, so that's the episode on covenant. What is next? I think I might dip my toe in conversion, because actually looking at conversion to Judaism and conversion in Judaism, a lot of these concepts are kind of refined and approached from a new and creative angle. And conversion is actually a great way to talk about Jewish meaning as well. But that is an episode for another day. So thank you for being with me today. And I hope that you will continue your learning journey and continue finding so much beauty in your Jewish lives. Shalom uvracha, with peace and blessings from my bite to your bite. Bye.